Tonight's program, of course, is the second in the Forum Spring Series and the Forum's 135th program overall. And in it, we turn our attention back to the issue on which our programs focused last fall, the issue that actually inspired the Forum's founding back in 2005, the role of religion in American politics. Last August, the Forum hosted a program by Doug Smith, retired evangelical radio station manager, who embarked on a search for an alternative to the evangelical religious perspective, as a result of which he found and joined St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Cedar Falls. Doug's August program, How Did We Get Here? Evangelicals in the Age of Trump, explored how evangelical Christianity became the bedrock foundation of Donald Trump's MAGA movement. That program drew the largest audience in the Forum's long history. A key product of this politicized conservative evangelicalism's efforts was the notorious Project 2025, whose leadership and staff are conservative evangelicals who spent the Biden years drawing up the blueprint for how to seize the opportunity of a Trump victory to impose their agenda on America and destroy those elements of American society that oppose their point of view. Of course, Donald Trump lied when he denied any knowledge of what Project 2025 was, and in shaping his new administration, he has appointed a number of senior Project 2025 leaders to influential policy positions in his cabinet and elsewhere. The end result, of course, is that ultra-conservative evangelical Christians are redrawing the nation's government with the acquiescence of the now evangelical Republican Party and the backing of the wealthiest oligarchs in America. Doug is the right person to lead us on a deep dive into the role being played by right-wing evangelicals and their financiers in laying waste to America's governmental and cultural institutions. We are lucky to have him with us, and I ask you to join me in welcoming him back as a Forum presenter. Doug, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, and thanks to everyone. Really, I appreciate your taking time to watch this here tonight. Okay. Are we?
You're sharing.
We should be?
Yes.
Okay. I also want to thank the Canterbury Forum Program Committee for asking me to do this presentation, although I have to admit it has required me to be more tuned into the news than is probably good for my mental health. I heard someone comment that these past 10 weeks have been hallucinatory, and I would agree. I keep thinking that I'm going to wake up, things will go back to normal, but they're not. There's never been a comparable time in American history to this. What we're experiencing right now is absolutely unprecedented. I'll use the term evangelical tonight rather than Christian in most contexts, because evangelicalism is a subset of Christianity. I critique evangelicalism from the perspective of a former insider. I know the language and the subtleties, and I was deeply immersed in the white evangelical world for most of my adult life and conservative in my political views. Those have all changed over the past 15 or 20 years. For more on my background and more on the more in-depth dive into how this world that evangelical Christians created came to be, I would invite you to watch my previous Canterbury presentation from last August, and you can watch it on my Substack page. I'll leave this slide up for a moment for you to write it down, or if you want, you could photograph it or commit it to memory. And you can watch it later at your leisure if you so desire. I hope to put tonight's presentation on that same page later this week, as soon as I figure it out again. And if you want, you can share it with others. And I'll post both the Zoom video and the text version.
No, I didn't want. No, I don't. I've got to mute it.
Politically active evangelicals are now running the country. I know it looks like Donald Trump and Elon Musk, but the folks who created the world we're living in today are evangelicals. They've been working on this for the past 45 years, and they finally arrived in the promised land, where all their wishes and plans are coming true. They view Trump's victory last November as a mandate from God, Project 2025, a product of the Heritage Foundation, shows how their extensive preparation and policy proposals are now being implemented. We know that back in November, for the third election in a row, white evangelicals voted around 80% for Donald Trump. Anything less than that, and none of these elections would have even been close. So practically speaking, we can lay everything that Trump has done thus far at the feet of evangelicals, because without them, he wouldn't be president. You could reasonably ask, is Trump using the evangelicals, or are the evangelicals using Trump? Well, both are true, I suppose, but it's more a case of how the evangelicals finally found the person who would usher them into the center of power. And tonight I'll be focusing primarily on how evangelicals are implementing their current power over decision-making in America and on the issues they said were most important to them. For the benefit of those who didn't see my August presentation, and as a general review, let me share the main points of how we got to here. Evangelicalism, as we know it today, began as fundamentalism back around the turn of the 20th century. Fundamentalists refused to accept any changes to their traditional doctrines in spite of the new discoveries in science and learning in the late 1800s. So for 25 or 30 years, they argued with more moderate Christians and fought over control of seminaries and denominations. In fact, many denominations ended up splitting. After the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, 100 years ago this summer, the fundamentalists quietly left the public stage and began world building from within. After World War II, fundamentalism itself split, with a group calling themselves evangelicals coming to the forefront. Their doctrinal beliefs were the same as the fundamentalists, but these new evangelicals wanted to become more winsome and less strident. Billy Graham was the best known of this new generation of leaders in the 1950s. Many evangelical churches and colleges in the 1950s were located in the Jim Crow South. They were enraged with the Supreme Court decision in 1954 to desegregate the public schools. So rather than allow their children to attend integrated schools, many white churches opened their own private schools. Sometimes these were referred to as segregation academies. These popped up all over the South in the 1950s and some in the North as well. White families who could afford it sent their children there, where schools could and did refuse entry to African American children. In the 1970s, the federal government mandated that integration must extend to private schools and colleges as well, not just public schools. A well-known test case involved the IRS taking Bob Jones University in South Carolina to court over their interracial dating policy. When Bob Jones lost that case and subsequently lost their tax-exempt status, many Christian leaders were so angry at the federal government that they launched a movement that we know today as the religious right. Their goal from the start was to tear down and rebuild the federal government in their image, a government that would be built around their desire to run their institutions the way they wanted to. But rather than try to rally people around the issue of segregation, they decided amongst themselves to elevate a different issue, the issue of abortion, to be their rallying point. By this time in 1979, abortion had already been legal for 6 years since the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision. But soon the issue of abortion was winning elections for them and bringing in donations by the truckload. An entire empire was being built by these people and their donors and the organizations they were starting, such as the Heritage Foundation. The religious right was aided and abetted by right-wing media who amplified their messages and pumped them out to the masses across the country. And to make a long story short, this led us to Donald Trump, a man who is the very antithesis of Christ-like behavior, but is seen by evangelicals as the one who will help them tear down and rebuild this country according to their interpretation of biblical principles. I was there at the start of this era. Not that I was involved in any decision-making back then, but I was aware of what was going on, and for the most part, agreeing with it. My career in Christian radio, and yes, that is me, began back in 1976, and I watched all the major players do their thing. James Dobson, Francis Schaeffer, Tim LaHaye, Jerry Falwell, Phyllis Schlafly, Jim Baker, and Mike Pence. Yes, the AM/FM Christian station I worked for back in Indiana in the early 90s ran his syndicated radio show on our AM station. Even though I'm now an Episcopalian and politically identify as liberal, I still have many friends and family in the evangelical world. So I'm not here to throw all evangelicals under the bus. Not all evangelicals are Christian nationalists, just like not all Republicans are Trump voters. My definition for who is a Christian nationalist is someone who believes that their understanding of the Bible is so superior to everyone else's that it must be enshrined into civil law. So everyone in the nation has to live by their interpretations of Christian doctrine. You know, kind of like the Taliban does with the Quran. That's what I was doing up until 2003, voting for the person and the party that will bring America back to God, wanting to turn America into a Christian nation. The majority of evangelicals are Christian nationalists. Oddly enough, some of them don't think of themselves as such. Here's an example. Last year, an evangelical friend and former coworker watched my previous presentation and disagreed with my definition of Christian nationalism. He told me, "I am not interested in a theocracy. I am interested in building a society that stands on clear biblical principles." He was unable to see the obvious contradiction. So I replied that he was missing the whole point that I was making. Jesus never told his followers to change the country or society in which they live. We are told to change ourselves as we follow the teachings of Jesus. But that impulse to Christianize America runs so deep, they don't even think about it. It's just part of their tribal identity. The rank and file evangelical is a good law-abiding citizen. Most of them are good neighbors. They care about people, and they help others when they can, and they try to act in loving ways. The problem is they can't see beyond their bubble. The evangelical bubble is the way that their worldview and their church involvement and their media choices tend to crowd out all other interactions with their fellow citizens. They don't have any friends outside of church friends who think the same way they do, and they have no outside activities or involvements that would allow them to broaden their world. It's also very easy to make them fearful of the world outside their bubble. So what happens is when, for example, the rights of gay or trans citizens are attacked or immigrants are kicked out without due process, they have no frame of reference. The churches and religious organizations they're a part of are exclusionary. So they don't have any gay or trans friends. They see them as people to be afraid of. So the empathy that you would expect to see from them just isn't there. Without irony, they can study the story of the Good Samaritan on Sunday and then pass on by the hurting trans kid or a dispossessed immigrant family on Monday. These are not mean or evil people. They're simply oblivious to the harm that their votes are inflicting on the vulnerable people around them. I was oblivious for many years. These are the people whose views are now ascendant in America. These people are now in charge. Even though the Trump regime is only a little over 2 months old, vast amounts of harm have already been done. Let's look at what the Heritage Foundation set out to do with Project 2025. Now, the Heritage Foundation is a think tank with a conservative evangelical perspective. What version of America do they want to create? This is a direct cut and paste from the foreword to Project 2025. The authors of each chapter express consensus recommendations along 4 broad fronts that will decide America's future. Restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. Dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. Defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. Secure our God-given individual rights to live freely, what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. Now, perhaps the first thing to say about this is that evangelicals see the world in a very specific way. and it may be very different from the way you do. As you look back over the past 4 or 5 decades, you might say we've made progress in many areas. Women's rights. Women have been able to make decisions for themselves, personally, educationally, and financially, in ways that they hadn't been able to, even as recently as the early 1970s. You'd certainly say we've made great strides in race relations. Not perfect by any means, but better than they were back in the 60s. You might point with justifiable pride at the fact that LGBTQ citizens are now accepted and included to a greater degree than they ever have been. Again, not perfect, but better than it was as recently as the 1990s, and at least up until now, enjoying the full protection of the law. You might also see as a good thing that people who hold minority religious beliefs are no longer held back and discriminated against. Jews, Muslims, Native Americans, and anyone who has a minority religious orientation is not pushed aside as easily as they used to be. Upholding the anti-establishment clause of the First Amendment has been national policy since the mid-1960s. But evangelicals do not see the world this way. They see these very same trends as bad. In fact, not just bad, but as attacks on them. You see, to them, the term religious freedom means the right to live in a country that allows them the freedom to impose their interpretations of the Bible on everyone else. I have the right to refuse service to anyone if I believe they are in violation of my religious beliefs. And this goes for pharmacists, landlords, cake bakers, photographers, doctors, nurses, wedding license clerks, everyone who deals with the public. My religious freedom allows me to hold you to my sincerely held religious beliefs. The cultural changes of the past few decades are viewed by white evangelicals as attacks on them because they held the religious and cultural power in this country for so long. They believed that advances by previously marginalized groups are chipping away at their power and control, and they are not going to give up their power without a fight. That's what we're seeing right now. That's what Project 2025 is all about. The one issue that permeates Project 2025 is the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, not just in government, but across all sectors of the country. So let's look at what Project 2025 has to say about DEI. I did a word search for the word diversity within that document and found 53 uses of the word, all, of course, in a negative context. It first appears on page 4 in the foreword. The next president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. Now, allow me to translate. The phrase, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights, that's what I'm talking about when I say that they see the freedom of religion in the First Amendment as anything that restricts them from imposing their views on anyone else. That sentiment echoes through every chapter of Project 2025. Over and over, diversity is mocked, denigrated, vilified, and marked for elimination. No aspect of the government will escape if all of their recommendations are enacted. And it would extend to all private companies that deal in some way with the federal government, and is all in the service of protecting and enhancing the power of straight, white, Christian males, period. Never forget that. Trump's first executive orders established a federal policy of recognizing 2 genders only, ending all DEI-related activities in the federal workforce, rescinding a number of DEI-related executive orders issued by prior administrations, including the one that requires federal contractors to implement affirmative action programs. Another order directed the Attorney General to identify private sector companies and large nonprofits with DEI programs, threatening them with investigations, litigation, and regulatory action. The Doge Group, run by Elon Musk, is already responsible for thousands of firings from the federal workforce. And you can thank an evangelical on your way out the door. As a former evangelical myself, I can tell you that many of them will recoil at this explanation as being unfair and inaccurate. Some would also say that their objections to DEI are not about wanting to hurt people, but about extreme positions that they believe some DEI programs take, in some cases being too heavy-handed and too focused on percentages and mandates. Is that possible? Were there ways that some DEI programs could be changed and improved? Of course. Communication and negotiation could have helped to resolve those kinds of issues. Now, I'm no expert on trans issues, but it seems to me that a rational discussion could be had around topics like the many difficult medical issues that need to be discussed, especially as it relates to trans children. In the short term, we need parental involvement in all decisions related to their minor children. And in the longer term, we need to embark on long-term studies of the effect of medical interventions at different ages to try to understand better what does and does not help the child. But we can't have that calm and rational discussion about how to accommodate trans kids because politicians are trying, as a matter of public policy, to use the power of the state to make it impossible for trans people to live their lives in public and simply be themselves. They see these as winning issues for them, and they're not wrong. That issue has been a winner here in Iowa and now nationally as well, in spite of the tiny percentage of the population who identify as trans. It's a classic example of using fear of the other to gain power. Theologian Reinhold Niebuhr once observed that the goodness of the individual person in their immediate relationships will disappear when they act as a member of a group. In other words, people can be both good in their personal relationships, yet act cruelly when they're part of a group. And this is exactly what I see happening in today's evangelical churches. As individuals, I know there are countless good people who sincerely want to act in loving ways. And yet, when the fearful faithful vote as a group, they're much more susceptible to fear-mongering by their leaders, thus making them capable of taking away the rights of other citizens, scapegoating vulnerable people, elevating cruel liars to positions of power, and trying to overthrow the majority vote of their fellow citizens. They will vote the way their leaders and the people in their tribe want and expect them to vote. They will also say that their opposition to DEI is all about merit, wanting places in college admissions and in hiring to be based solely on the person's ability to do the job, not realizing or not acknowledging that throughout most of our history, white males have had the sole benefit of affirmative action. They didn't have to be the best, they just had to be the best white males available at the time. How long will it take before we stamp out this pernicious and utterly false belief that any minority that is hired is taking the place of a better qualified white man? The reality is that all DEI was trying to do is make sure that better qualified women and minorities are not pushed aside in favor of mediocre or incompetent white males, which has been going on since time immemorial. And speaking of incompetent white men, Washington Post columnist Karen Attiah wrote, "Let's call this what it really is, resegregation." By reneging on DEI, we're once again throwing the burden of proof back on the shoulders of every woman in a position of authority and every Black student in an exclusive college and every minority employee everywhere to show that they're not affirmative action babies. It's not fair to make them work twice as hard for half the credit. Project 2025's ambitious agenda goes far beyond just eliminating DEI initiatives. In just the first few weeks of the Trump administration, there have been over 90 executive orders signed. The thing about executive orders is that they're quick to implement, but they don't have the permanence of law, like an act of Congress. You can get a lot done very fast this way, but an executive order won't last longer than the president's term. But you can also do a lot of damage in 4 years. There's no way he could have come up with this daily advent calendar of chaos without Project 2025 organizing it for him, which, by the way, he denied any knowledge of during the campaign, if you remember. Several organizations are tracking the executive orders so far to figure out which ones can be traced directly back to Project 2025. According to Politico, and this was back on February 11th, there have been 37 examples of the language of Project 2025 appearing in Trump's executive orders. For example, Project 2025 calls for taxpayer funding of private religious schools, something it calls education freedom. Not educational, education freedom. We've already seen this, of course, in Iowa. Now they want it for all 50 states. So the wording of an executive order for the Education Department says, quote, the Secretary of Education shall include education freedom, same form of the word, education, as a priority in discretionary grant programs. Here are some other examples of the exact language from Project 2025 in executive orders. Now, I'm not going to try to read all of these. I'll give you a moment to look these over. All of these are just the implementation of the ideology in Project 2025. Over the past few weeks, there have been many more additions. I just don't have time to go back and list them all. My point here is that these executive orders take language directly from Project 2025. Christian nationalists have been hard at work since Inauguration Day, getting their agenda implemented. They wrote these, put them in front of Trump, and he signed them. So if you don't like them, you know where they came from. They're just putting into action what the religious right has been demanding for the past 45 years. And it doesn't stop there. Many of the authors of various parts of Project 2025 are now running the parts of the government they wrote about. There were 144 authors involved in writing Project 2025, and here are just a few who are now implementing what they wrote. Russell Vought. He wrote the chapter on the Executive Office of the President and is described as the architect of Project 2025, and now he is running the Office of Management and Budget. It's largely his vision that's behind the massive layoffs of civil servants. He doesn't see himself as just a conservative. He says he's a radical constitutionalist, meaning he wants to dismantle the Constitution and create a new one. Stephen Miller, responsible for much of the anti-immigration rhetoric in Project 2025, and he's now the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and the Homeland Security Advisor. Brendan Carr, he authored a chapter on the Federal Communications Commission for Project 2025, and now he's the chairman of the FCC. He's already launched or threatened investigations into ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and NPR. Tom Homan, overall contributor to Project 2025 on immigration policy, and has now been appointed border czar. Peter Navarro authored a chapter on the case for fair trade. He's now the senior counselor for trade and manufacturing and is behind the current tariff wars against Canada and Mexico. Paul Atkins, a contributor to the section on federal regulatory agencies, he now leads the Securities and Exchange Commission. Atkins is on record opposing social justice, sustainability, and diversity campaigns in the business world. I could go on and on. John Ratcliffe as CIA Director, Monica Crowley as Assistant Secretary of State, Caroline Leavitt as the new White House Press Secretary, and many others. But I think it's clear that the Heritage Foundation and those who actually helped write Project 2025 are now running the government. And they intend to implement all of Project 2025, all 922 pages. White evangelicals played a very long game and are finally at the summit of power. But what are they doing with their power? Are they implementing the Sermon on the Mount? Are they loving their neighbors as themselves? No, they're at the summit, kicking down at everyone who isn't like them. Perhaps now is a good time to identify the great circle of life in American politics. At the top are the billionaires of America, approximately 1,000 individuals and their families. Call them our oligarchs, because that's exactly what they are. And they have only one goal: keeping and growing their wealth. They will do anything to prevent their empires from diminishing. Most of them are not Christian nationalists, but they use them to accomplish their one goal of keeping and growing their wealth. And by the way, Trump's cabinet is the wealthiest set of appointments in history and includes several billionaires. So how rich are our oligarchs? Well, here are a couple of charts that I think help to illustrate. First, let's take a look back at 1989, just 36 years ago. Notice that the richest person in the world was Japanese, with just under $16 billion. Only 3 Americans were in the top 15. Those are the red lines. Sam Walton was the richest American at that time, with about $12 billion. Let's move ahead now to today, in 2025. All but one of the top 15 wealthiest people in the world are Americans, with Elon Musk on top with almost $400 billion. Even accounting for inflation, that's an obscene jump in wealth. When I said that their goal is keeping and growing their wealth, this is what I'm talking about. Of course, in every culture throughout time, the top of the food chain has always been ruling and fooling the bottom. Think about ancient Rome, where the rich provided bread and circuses for the masses, while at the same time enriching themselves and pushing the tax burden down to the poor. And medieval Christianity, where the poor paid for the massive churches and great art and lavish lifestyle of the clergy in exchange for freedom from hell. Today, the billionaire class provides the masses with professional football, college football, which I guess is also professional football now, and plenty of exciting semi-scripted reality shows in exchange for voting for those who will lower taxes for them. Our oligarchs fund 3 main institutions: politics, media, and religion, because all 3 of them help them keep and grow their wealth. So let's look at politics first. Who decides who can run for president? Well, we may think that we do, because we have primary elections for each party, and they decide who will represent each party in the general election. But who decides who can be in the primary election? That's right, our oligarchs. By giving and withdrawing money from various contenders, they decide who we get to vote for. They give the candidates the millions of dollars they need to make their case to the voters. And as time goes on, some candidates may appear weaker than others. So the billionaires will change their bets and withdraw funding from some candidates. That's why some have to withdraw from the race before primaries are even held. It's not that they lost their will to win. It's that they lost the support of their billionaire overlords. We, the voters, only have the illusion of choice. And it's the same with Senate and House candidates and with candidates for governor. They all have their billionaire financial backers. So when these candidates get elected, who do they serve? Whose interests are they looking out for? Not ours, I can tell you that. And it's never been more obvious than over the past 10 weeks. The current emphasis on tax cutting is a major goal of our oligarchs. That's the reason for Elon Musk's chainsaw, cutting the federal workforce and canceling contracts and slashing budgets. The reason is to justify more tax cuts. They're not content to simply extend the current low tax rates. They want them even lower. So how can they explain that to people who know that the government is already running a deficit? Simply by saying that after all this cost cutting, Americans deserve to keep more of that money for themselves. What they don't say is that for every dollar the average worker sees, The billionaires get orders of magnitude more. Billionaires also fund the media. Now, we've always known about the Murdoch family and their ownership of Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, and many other news outlets. But what's becoming more and more apparent is the control by the billionaires over what we used to refer to as the mainstream media. The Washington Post, owned by Amazon billionaire Jeff Bezos, has ordered a right turn on their editorial page and fired those who wouldn't go along. Many others have resigned. Editorial cartoonist Ann Telnaes resigned after this cartoon was rejected for publication, depicting Bezos, along with depictions of Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, the Walt Disney Company, which owns ABC, and Los Angeles Times owner Patrick Soon-Shiong bending the knee to Trump. The Post's slogan is, "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, sometimes it dies in broad daylight too. Traditional and social media are awash in the money of billionaires. There are actually two ways oligarchs can control the media. They can own the media outright, or they can intimidate the media outlets. Take the three historic TV networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. They've all given in to pressure and capitulated in a number of ways already. I don't think we can count on them for bold reporting on anything in the coming years. The revolution will not be televised. And the stunt about the so-called Gulf of America, you may think that's childish, and it is, but it had a purpose, so that Trump could punish news organizations that refused to acknowledge it, as he knew that some would. The Associated Press, for example, which I consider the gold standard for objective, fact-based reporting, has been kicked out of the White House press briefing room because they refused to knuckle under, which in a way is handy because if you want to know if you can trust a particular news source, check to see how it refers to the Gulf of Mexico, and you'll have your answer. Media organizations are now under control or under attack. So, billionaires control politics and the media. What about religion? I'm sure someone is thinking, boy, I hope they show up next Sunday and drop $1 million in the offering plate. No, that's not what I mean. They don't really care about religion per se. They care about how religious organizations can manipulate their followers into voting the way they want them to. Project 2025 is a product of numerous evangelical organizations, most of which are funded by our oligarchs. Take the Koch brothers, for example. The Koch organization has poured millions into right-wing Christian groups like Concerned Women for America, which got $11 million, and the Susan B. Anthony list, which received 1.5 million. Both groups specifically target women's rights. The main vehicle the Koch brothers use to bankroll their favorite causes is the Freedom Partners Chamber of Commerce. Through that organization, they give millions to many organizations and candidates. For example, back in 2014, it gave nearly $1 million to CitizenLink, which itself was founded by Focus on the Family, an evangelical Christian organization that opposes women's rights and LGBTQ rights. I recently learned about a secretive organization called Ziklag, which is funded by the billionaire Uline family, who made a fortune in office supplies, and the Green family, who own the Hobby Lobbies around the country, and the Wallers, who own the Jockey Apparel Corporation, and many other like-minded ultra-rich folks. ProPublica obtained thousands of Ziklag's members-only email newsletters, strategy documents, and fundraising pitches, none of which had been previously made public. They revealed the group's long-term goal to undercut every major sphere of influence in American society with their version of right-wing Christianity. So these billionaire families donate to Ziklag, then they turn that money around and give it to Christian nationalist organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is the evangelical legal group that led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and Turning Point USA, founded by Charlie Kirk to activate young Republican campus groups, and a constellation of other right-wing advocacy groups. Ziklag contributed heavily to political advertising in Arizona to try to flip that state to the Trump column. Here's what ProPublica reported in July of last year. According to the Ziklag files, the group divided its 2024 activities into 3 different operations, targeting voters in battleground states. There was Operation Checkmate, focusing on funding so-called election integrity groups, which of course is also known as voter suppression. Operation Steeplechase, concentrated on using churches and pastors to get out the vote. And Operation Watchtower, aimed at galvanizing voters around opposition to transgender rights and policies supporting healthcare for trans people, and framed as parental rights. And Ziklag is doing all of this while registered as a nonprofit charity, 501c3. Now, legally, a charity does not have to publicly disclose the names of its donors, and donations are tax deductible. In exchange, it is, quote, this is from IRS regulations, absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in any political campaign, end of quote. Of course, who's running the IRS now? So don't expect any enforcement anytime soon. Ziklag was the brainchild of a Silicon Valley entrepreneur named Ken Eldred. After Trump was elected in 2016, Eldred had an idea. He wanted all the wealthy Christians to come together to create a donor network specifically for Christian billionaires, if that's a thing. The name Ziklag comes from 1 Chronicles 12. It was the town where David's mighty men found refuge from King Saul. Internal documents show that Ziklag's goal is to take dominion over the 7 mountains, funding Christian projects or installing devout Christians in leadership positions to reshape each mountain in a godly way. Remember, we talked about the 7 mountains mandate back in my August presentation. And those 7 mountains are government, media, arts and entertainment, business, education, religion, and the family. They believe that if they can claim victory over all 7 mountains, America can proclaim itself to be a Christian nation. By the way, speaking of arts and entertainment, remember a few weeks ago when Trump took control of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts? Well, that confused me at first. Why bother with that? But then it occurred to me, it's a cultural institution. And I think we know how the culture and the arts drive change in society. We've seen that in many areas over the past several decades. So now they're trying to muzzle cultural institutions because that's what changes people's minds about things. So be on the lookout for more incursions into popular culture. It's an attempt to suppress the influence of the arts. And of course, you can add the recent takeover of the Smithsonian Institution to that list. Ziklag is serious about claiming control over all these areas of American life. One particularly relevant area, especially here in Iowa, affects education. Ziklag's leaders, according to ProPublica, have focused on the public school system. In a 2021 meeting, Ziklag's Education Mountain chair, Peter Bollinger, said that their goal is to take down the public education system as we know it today. What else could explain the throttling of Iowa's public education system better than this? Not to mention the school voucher scam, giving public money to private Christian schools that's enriching the wealthy at the expense of the taxpayers. Now, I could go on and on, giving you many more specific instances where billionaires are funding Christian nationalist organizations with names like the DeVos family from Amway, the Dan Cathy family from Chick-fil-A, the Adolph Kors family, and many others. But I don't have the time. The bottom line is that billionaires are very happy to tear down governmental institutions and give evangelicals control over huge chunks of policy initiatives like Project 2025, as long as they, the billionaires, are left alone to pursue their one goal. And what is that, class? Keeping and growing their wealth. So you may be asking, how is all of this going to affect the future of evangelicalism? A recent survey by Pew Research shows that the share of the population who identify as evangelical Protestant continues to drop from 26% to 23% over the past 15 years or so, according to a new religious landscape survey. Identification with Christianity across the board is also dropping in all categories. So where are they going? This survey also shows that the religiously unaffiliated category is growing. They're now nearly 30% of the population. You know what's really sad? All my life, I have been taught, and I believe, that helping churches grow was a good thing. Now I no longer believe that. As I look at the impact that evangelical Christian nationalist churches are having, which I was a part of for most of my life, they're doing far more harm than good. These churches are now a warped and twisted caricature of the church. As the evangelical world becomes more extreme and more tied into the policies of the Trump regime, it's turning a lot of people away in disgust. Russell Moore, editor-in-chief of the magazine Christianity Today and a Trump critic, says he thinks the evangelical world is in crisis because, in his words, having multiple pastors tell me essentially the same story about quoting the Sermon on the Mount in their preaching, turn the other cheek and that sort of thing, and to have someone come up after the sermon to say, where did you get these liberal talking points? And what was alarming to me is that in most of these scenarios, when the pastor would say, I'm literally quoting Jesus Christ, the response would not be, I apologize. The response would be, yes, but that doesn't work anymore. That's weak. And when we get to the point where the teachings of Jesus himself are seen as subversive to us, then we're in a crisis. Personally, I don't even recognize American evangelicalism anymore. It's even worse now than when I left it in 2010. I always wondered what the end game was for evangelicals who wanted to turn America back to God. What would they do if they ever had the power to do what they wanted? When the dog chasing the car actually caught the car? Well, we're now finding out. They are tearing America apart at the seams. Donald Trump presented a test of character for evangelicals, and almost all of them failed the test. Those who do stay within the evangelical Christian nationalist world, even though it's shrinking, are becoming louder and more strident. I think it's a lot like reducing a chicken stock. The more it boils down, the more intense it becomes. It's this intensity that we're seeing today. Many of the people who still want to identify as evangelicals are doing so, not because they're attracted by the countercultural message that Jesus taught about loving unconditionally or loving their enemies, but because it makes them feel like winners. The church is absorbing the values of the culture around it to the point where they are fully in favor of culture wars and retribution and insurrections and all kinds of things that are diametrically opposed to the actual teachings of Jesus. Jesus never advocated for temporal power. In a February 4th, 2025 article on Sojourners.com, Ryan Duncan writes, Jesus never sought political power or sided with those who held it. In fact, he outright rejected it on numerous occasions. Instead, Jesus made his place amongst the lowly. In short, Jesus was for the losers. No matter how often his name is invoked in the pursuit of power, the fact that he sided with the powerless remains constant. So, what is our response to this? How can we fight against all these billionaires arrayed against us? Well, first and foremost, we must be aware of the larger battle that we're in. This isn't just about Project 2025. This goes much deeper. It's a battle over who America belongs to. Is it by and for our billionaire oligarchs, and we're just living in the world they create for us? Or is America for we the people? Remember, the ones that write the checks make the rules. So as long as the billionaires of America are funding the political campaigns of the politicians, as long as they own and or control the media, including social media, and as long as they're bankrolling the quasi-religious organizations that millions of well-meaning but clueless evangelicals trust, they will continue to win. Now, there are a couple of obvious ways to roll back the power of our oligarchs. One is to raised the marginal tax rate back to where they were previously in our history. In post-war America, the top tax rate got as high as around 90%. From 1964 to 1980, the top tax rate was about 70%. Today, it stands at 37%. Reagan began the tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, and it's no coincidence that the 1980s are when we started to see the beginnings of stratospheric income inequality and politicians beginning to shift their focus from their constituents to their donors. Another helpful step would be for Congress to repeal the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, which opened the spigots for a flood of unaccountable money into the election process. Ultimately, the best way to stop the oligarchs in their relentless march is a constitutional amendment that allows only federal funding for all elections. That means that the money candidates spend on their campaigns would come solely from the federal treasury, and every candidate would get the same amount. Yes, I know that these ideas seem politically impossible. How do you persuade politicians to vote against the billionaires who have made their political careers possible? But unless we somehow do this, throw off the control of the billionaires, we'll never regain control of our own future as a country. So in the short term, what do we do? How do we stand in the way of Project 2025? How do we begin to throttle back the fire hose of hate that we're subjected to every day? I believe the answer is action. Action is the antidote to anxiety. Politically active evangelicals are not going anywhere, but we are not going anywhere either. One way to take action is to make our voices heard. I've talked with many of you who have been calling or writing your senators and representatives, and most report that you get the cold shoulder or no answer at all. It doesn't matter. Keep those calls and letters going. They're not actually reading your letters, but someone in their office is keeping track of the comments, both for and against the various issues. I have heard that sending a letter is actually more impactful than a phone call because of the visual impact that stacks of mail provide. They may not respond personally, but if a big enough groundswell begins to worry them about their prospects for re-election, they will begin to at least pay attention. You can bet they're paying attention to the folks who are afraid that Social Security is on the brink of collapse. There are only 535 people in the country who can slow down the Trump agenda: the 435 members of the House and the 100 members of the Senate. It's their own power they are yielding to the Trump team. But if they believe that it's in their own best interest, they will eventually assert their own rights and responsibilities. And I think that will become even more of a possibility as Trump voters are being hurt by his actions. Have you seen the videos of those town hall meetings where Republicans are being yelled at by their own voters? Those folks are mad, and they were Trump voters. That's why the order has gone out. No more town hall meetings. More angry Trump voters are likely to show up on TV screens. Public opinion could swing the other way in a hurry. I believe that hubris always carries within itself the seeds of its own downfall. That could happen in some way, similar to how the hubris of the Nixon administration led to the Watergate scandal. In a way, it's like when we as parents tried to let our kids experience natural consequences. Like if your son wants to wear shorts in the snow and gets cold, he might choose to wear something else the next day. Turns out there are natural consequences to voting for a convicted felon. Who knew? Some people got to touch the hot stove for themselves, right? So your voice, together with many others who are feeling the pain, can make a difference. Don't discount your impact when you contact Congress. Here are some helpful hints on contacting your representative. Make your point clearly and respectfully. Be brief, include data if it's available, include a personal story of how a policy has affected you, and send it off. That's all you need to do. Another way to take action is by joining local groups, advocating for the causes you care about. Blue Dot Iowa, Three House Campus Ministry, Waterloo Catholic Worker House, Cedar Valley Social Justice Coalition, Cedar Valley Advocates for Immigrants and Refugee Rights, One Iowa Action, the Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, Indivisible of Iowa, the Cedar Valley LGBTQ Coalition. Take a photo of this page or come back to it in a couple of days when this video is on my Substack page. And there are plenty more organizations in our community besides just these who need your participation. Join one or more of these groups and get busy. This is no time to sit on the sidelines. People are being hurt in so many ways by the actions of our government. So find a way to help those who are suffering because of this injustice. If you're able to, contribute to candidates and causes and organizations that you believe in. We may not be able to match the donations of the billionaires, but even smaller amounts can and do make a difference. We should try to jam the spokes of the wheels trying to grind us down in any way we can. No amount is too small to give. We're going to have to get out of our comfort zones. Get involved in some protest marches. There's a big one coming up Saturday, April 5th at Lincoln Park in Waterloo, organized by the Blue Dot Iowa organization. It'll be at 1:30 this coming Saturday afternoon, this Saturday. So come and bring a sign. The more people who show up at these marches, the more press coverage we'll get. During last year's campaign, I did something I've never done before. I went door knocking for a state Senate candidate. Now that candidate lost, but I feel like I was better connected to the process, and I plan to do it again, and I hope you will too. Pick a candidate you believe in and get out there and knock on doors and make phone calls and write postcards, anything you can do to help. Can you imagine the impact an army of committed volunteers would make in 2026? You can make a difference. I've also been writing letters to the editor on a regular basis for the past year or so in an attempt to reveal the complicity and the hubris of the evangelical church in all of this. I'm trying to help evangelicals see that they and their institutions are the last major group in America still fighting against basic human rights for everyone, and that they're doing so in the name of Christianity. Have you ever noticed there's a way in which certain words and behaviors are excused if they're coming from a religious point of view? Oh, you say the Bible told you to discriminate against these people? Well, it must be okay then. No, it's not okay. Bigotry wrapped in religion is still bigotry. They're clearly violating the most basic and easily understandable teachings in the Bible in order to advocate for their political agenda. Evangelicals and their churches and organizations need to be held to the same standards of empathy and human rights that we expect of everyone else. Anytime you must choose between your religion and your neighbor, choose your neighbor. That's what Jesus taught us. That was the whole point of the gospel stories about Jesus healing lame people and blind people on the Sabbath. Sure, there were religious rules in the Old Testament forbidding work on the Sabbath, but that didn't stop Jesus from lifting up the hurting people around him. I think people who call themselves Christians and are using Christianity to justify taking away people's rights are actually taking the name of the Lord in vain. We need to speak truth to power. We need to be courageous, like Bishop Marianne Buddy. We need to learn the truth, speak the truth, and spread the truth. Don't be distracted by the outrage du jour. Focus on what's truly important: people and families being hurt and threats to our democracy. But please remember, your neighbor with the Trump yard sign is not your enemy. The people who attend the evangelical church down the road are not your enemy. They're being used as pawns in a game most of them don't even know is being played. The only way you can persuade them away from the dark side is by being a good neighbor. Don't hide your opinions, but don't be angry or argue with them either. I believe there are evangelicals in our neighborhoods who will at some point wake up to the harm being perpetrated in their name, just like I woke up about 20 years ago and made some major attitude adjustments. If I can change, so can others. You won't persuade them with arguments or even facts. Just be a caring neighbor, a loving presence in their lives. You can't change their minds for them, but you can be the catalyst that helps them change their own mind. I know it's hard, but relationships matter. Maybe sometimes relationships can't be maintained and there's just nothing you can do to preserve it. But if it's possible, please don't allow relationships to come apart over politics. Maybe you have to agree not to talk about certain issues, and that's okay, especially within families. You only get one family, and those relationships are more important than politics. We can fight and protest against the policies and the plans that Christian nationalism has in store for us without arguing with those nearest to us. It's easier when you remember they're being duped by the voices they trust. It all boils down to epistemology. Who do you trust to tell you the truth? People trust those billionaire-controlled media sources, and it fills them with fear. What they don't realize is it's the business model of those media sources to create fear and confusion. So fear is a natural response for those people, even though it's a fear based on lies and misinformation. In churches, people trust their friends and their pastors who are telling them what to think and who to fear and how to vote. People are fearful because the information sources they trust are telling them they're being persecuted. So be the information source that gently reminds them that we don't have to respond with fear. Again, not argumentatively or with anger or insults, but with a respect for them and the fear they're feeling. The only real way to encourage change, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We are in for a very tough next 4 years. Nobody is coming to rescue us. We're going to have to rescue ourselves. So take care of yourself and your own mental and physical health. Don't watch MSNBC constantly. You can't do that and keep your equilibrium. Don't doom scroll through social media or join in every Facebook argument you're invited to. Stay informed, stay active, but stay healthy too. Find a supportive community of like-minded people. Don't allow yourself to become radicalized or demoralized or anesthetized to the damage being done to people and institutions. And that's a very real danger if you're not careful. Remember, the antidote for anxiety is action. Use your outrage as your fuel for positive action. Get in good trouble, necessary trouble, as John Lewis counseled us. The next 4 years won't be easy. It will take all of us working together to protect the vulnerable and preserve democracy. I'll leave you with the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Thank you.
And thank you, Doug. Thank you very, 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 very much. So we have comments and questions coming in through the chat box. I'm going to stop the recording now. So if you want to also raise your comments and questions by unmuting yourself, feel free to do that. Here we go.